In early 1920, cryptic adverts began to appear in German newspapers stating, "Du musst Caligari werden," you must become Caligari. This innovative marketing campaign heralded the arrival of one of the most talked about films, not just of the silent era, but of all time. The cabinet of Dr. Caligari's place in film history is carved in granite, but that can be obscuring. A film of such vast influence that it's almost impossible to discuss it objectively, whose meaning has been so endlessly debated that to have an opinion is to enter a minefield, whose visuals were so extraordinary that everyone involved scrambled to take credit, yet whose framing story was latterly so derided that everyone scrambled to distance themselves. Rather than elevating its director Robert Wiener, it has distorted our perception of his career. But Caligari also obscures itself, a film forever in the shadow of its own reputation. Contrary to what first-time viewers expect, The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari opens in naturalistic surroundings. It's the performances that are unsettling, and the dialogue. Then Francis, played by Friedrich Feyer, begins his story, and we are in another world. I can't imagine what that moment was like for viewers in 1920. Even today, that establishing shot of the town of Holstenval remains as effective a piece of storytelling as Once Upon a Time, telling us that what we are about to see is not real, and placing the film at the forefront of German Expressionist cinema. Expressionism as an artistic movement covers a lot of ground, so let's not get bogged down. From the point of view of the film, it's all about reducing to an idea. The idea of a fairground, of a street, of a council office, the hunched town clerk looking down on those seeking his favour. Expressionism dispenses with traditional cinematic devices. The lamplight is painted on the ground, the shadow painted on the wall. This fractured, angular world is the domain of a man whom Francis refers to simply as... Werner Krause's dominant performance as Dr. Caligari demonstrates that that expressionist paring down is not just about the sets. Acting too gives the expression of an emotion rather than the emotion itself. Sort of anti-method acting. There were tangible benefits to this style. It's cheaper to paint a theatrical flat than to hire a fairground. And producers recognised that these sets would create a sensation, so whether the film was good or bad, people would come, something that still happens today. But it would be wrong to dismiss this style as merely a gimmick. There are many interpretations of Expressionism's role. For me, it's about putting the audience in a certain state of mind. When my niece was a baby, she cried every time I came into the room because I look like her dad, but wrong. This is our world, but wrong, putting us immediately on edge, making us question everything. And this is a film in which nothing should be taken at face value. That said, one of the most memorable scenes uses traditional lighting to create atmosphere. Director Robert Wiener was wise enough not to let the film's philosophy get in its own way. Caligari introduces us to his sideshow act, Cesare, the fortune-telling somnambulist. In a matter of seconds, using only his eyes, actor Conrad Veidt creates one of cinema's most iconic images, capturing the pained rapture of a man who has been asleep for 23 years. Cesare foretells a grim future for Francis's friend, Alan. Which quickly comes to pass. Again, technically the shadows should be painted, but it's a good image. Francis now sets out to find the truth. That's the story, but it's the aesthetic that has been Caligari's enduring legacy. So, whose idea was it? According to Hans Janowitz, who wrote the script with Carl Mayer, their screenplay specified stylized sets in the style of the artist Alfred Kubin. Janowitz told this to historian Siegfried Kracauer, who included it in his influential, though largely debunked book, From Caligari to Hitler, and this became the accepted history. At the time, no original script was known to survive, but in the late 70s, that belonging to Werner Krauss emerged, containing no references to stylization or to Alfred Kubin. That chimes with the recollections of Erich Pommer, head of the Dekla Film Company, who said that the script by Janowitz and Mayer, two struggling playwrights with no film experience, was naturalistic, and it was he who instructed the designers to make the set stylized. But one of those same designers said that Pommer wasn't even in charge, that Rudolf Meinert was head of production, and he championed stylization against Pommer's objections. Designer Hermann Warm recalled consulting with artists Walter Reimann and Walter Rohrig, and together deciding that the script's unreal atmosphere called for a similarly unreal aesthetic. This version is now generally accepted, partly because Warm is the only person not claiming credit, giving the lion's share to Reimann, an expressionist artist whose style was deemed the most suitable. So, Janowitz was lying. Except Caligari looks nothing like the work of Alfred Kubin. Janowitz claimed that the German word Kubinischer, Kubinesque, was misread as Kubistischer, cubist. Why make that up? So perhaps the writers did have some say, just not in the script, a detail you might forget 20 years later. The honest answer to the question whose idea was it is, we don't know. But the number of people claiming it tells its own story. Pointedly absent from this discussion is director Robert Wiener. Like his film, Wiener is something of a mystery, deliberately vague about the date and country of his birth. In her book The Haunted Screen, Lottie Eisner identifies Caligari as Wiener's first film. In fact, it was close to his 20th. A director with an unimpeachable track record, well known enough to be caricatured in the press. And yet, until Uli Jung and Walter Schatzberg's book Beyond Caligari, on which we do draw heavily, there was a real lack of scholarship on Robert Wiener, which is baffling for the director of one of the most talked about films of all time. And make no mistake, regardless of his role in the expressionist styling, Caligari is recognisably a Robert Wiener film. The vast majority of Wiener's pre-Caligari films are lost, but one that survives is 1917's Fear, featuring madness, predictions of death, and Conrad Veidt in only his second screen role. Before Caligari, Wiener directed at least 3 other films involving madness and some form of hypnotic suggestion, alongside a series of very successful light comedies. I think one of the reasons we don't talk about Robert Wiener more is that for a film like Caligari, we want the director to be a forgotten genius or a tortured artist. Robert Wiener was a versatile, jobbing director doing the work that was in front of him. Caligari was one of 5 films that he directed that year, while scripting 3 more. But he recognised the chance to do something new. The film isn't exactly his vision, but we must credit him with how it is presented. In the script, we see the crate containing the somnambulist delivered, and Caligari opens it to reveal Cesare, his eyes already open. So, although this scene is exactly as described in the script, it's Wiener who gives it power by making it our introduction to Cesare. In our video about Nosferatu, we pointed out how the nature of the vampire is slowly revealed, each killing showing more than the previous one, and the same is true in Caligari. The first murder is reported. The second, we see shadows. The third attempt, we actually witness. It's not impossible this influenced Nosferatu director F.W. Murnau, who had just directed Saturnus, starring Conrad Veidt, from a script by Robert Wiener. It was Wiener too who introduced the love triangle, and who cut the bizarre appearance of Alan's ghost at the funeral. This is an experienced director at work. None of which is to suggest that the story came from anyone but its named authors. Years earlier at a Hamburg amusement park, Hans Janowitz saw a girl disappear into some bushes. The girl did not emerge, but a man did. The following day, Janowitz learnt that the girl had been murdered, and, attending her funeral, he again saw the man. This was the inspiration for the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. Maybe. Janowitz liked to embellish his stories. He also claimed that Caligari was based on an army psychiatrist whom Mayer convinced he was insane to avoid military service. In fact, Carl Mayer was discharged owing to a foot injury. Cesare was inspired by a spookily accurate fortune teller whom Janowitz visited with actress Gilda Lange, for whom the part of Jane was written, though it eventually went to Lil Dagover. Lange herself would die a month before Caligari premiered, fulfilling the fortune teller's prediction, although quite a long time after the event. Jane is an archetypal horror heroine, but before that archetype existed. She needs to be rescued, but is feisty enough to investigate for herself. An object of love to the heroes, of desire to the creature, and a plaything to the villain. Caligari sends Cesare to kill Jane, but he cannot do it. Her kidnap, the subsequent chase, and Cesare's death, his body mirroring the artificial trees, are a visual tour de force. The sequence clearly stuck with director James Whale, who would later restage the break-in for Universal's Frankenstein. Caligari's influence is vast, yet sometimes overstated. It is not, as some have claimed, the first horror film. It began a trend of stylization in some films, but we forget that most German films of this period weren't expressionist, and of those that were, few, if any, go this far. What it did do was move production into the studio, the majority of major German films of the 1920s preferring artificial sets to location shooting. Through these films, Caligari's influence has resonated down through Universal horror and film noir to Tim Burton and David Lynch. Its place in history is assured, and it's important to give Robert Wiener credit for it. He was a working director, making films that people watched and enjoyed, and if Caligari was the only time that he touched posterity, he deserves to be remembered for it. But if he gets the credit, he must also take some of the blame. Confession time. I don't love The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. I like it fine, I admire it tremendously. It looks amazing, there are great performances, and there are individual scenes that I love, but I'm never swept up by it. I find it static, and not just because the camera barely moves. The action plays out in long, stagey takes, and every scene in a given location is shot from the same camera position. Modern viewers tend to ascribe this to the film's age. That's how they made films back then. The problem with that is Abel Gance's J'accuse, or Hollywood swashbuckler The Mark of Zorro, or indeed a German film like Der Golem. All made around the same time, but films that move and take me with them. Caligari's style is way ahead of its time, but its camera work and editing are years behind. There are similar problems with Fear, suggesting that this was just how Robert Wiener worked, but Post-Caligari, more of his films survive, though most are still difficult to find. Genuine is a flawed but fascinating dark fantasy boasting a different kind of expressionist stylization, and here, Wiener's filmmaking is generally more creative. By the time of 1924's The Hands of Orlac, we get this electrifying sequence. This is the only other Wiener film in wide circulation today. Wiener may have been slow to adopt new techniques. He was a decade older than the emerging generation of expressionist filmmakers. Or it may have been about the money. Caligari was made cheaply and somewhat hurriedly. But it may also have been a deliberate decision, part of that expressionist paring away of cinematic artifice, leaving just the image. If that's the case, then for me personally, it doesn't work. And it's okay to say that, just like it would be with any other film. The other thing I dislike is the resolution. Francis pursues Caligari to an asylum. Where else would you find a madman? But like the reveals in Psycho or The Sixth Sense, familiarity makes it easy to forget what a shocking twist this is. The maniac is literally running the asylum. It's brilliant. But then Francis goes away and comes back again, replaying the revelation, but this time via a book, revealing that the Doctor is reenacting the crimes of an historical Caligari. The climax in a silent film should be seen, not read, although I do love the transition into flashback. They then read the Doctor's diary. I know real-world serial killers often keep diaries, but it's just not dramatic. More importantly, we knew this already. We had the shocking reveal. This highlights the inexperience of the writers, and it's worth knowing that Carl Mayer would increasingly eliminate titles from his scripts, culminating in Murnau's The Last Laugh. Was this a reaction to watching his first film and thinking, man, that's a lot of reading? But Wiener must share the blame. He made changes elsewhere. He could have changed this too. This is the end of the murder mystery, but not of the film, as we return to Francis telling his story for another twist. He himself is an inmate in the asylum, casting his fellow patients as characters in his tale, imagining the institution's benevolent doctor as the villain of his delusions. Of which he is now cured. According to Janowitz, he and Mayer considered the addition of a framing story a raping of our work. Now the expressionist style is simply the dream of a madman, rather than something integral to their story of a man driven mad by misuse of his own mental powers. After the premiere, the two writers wondered whether our future scripts would be produced in a crippled form by cowardly directors. Again, Siegfried Kracauer's book popularised the idea that Wiener had undermined the true meaning of a revolutionary film. We've already seen stylisation wasn't in the original script, so could hardly have been integral. That same script reveals that Janowitz and Mayer did include a framing story, but a far more prosaic one, in which Jane and Francis reminisce about the strange events that brought them together. Commentators have been back and forth on the framing story and happy ending, hating it and fating it, but here's the interesting thing. Francis's story is over, but the settings are still expressionist. And consider the final shot. Does this look like a happy ending? Or does it recall our first meeting with the Doctor? Has Caligari turned the tables on Francis, so his desperate pleas are written off as the ravings of a madman? It's been argued both ways, but as with any piece of art, it means what you take away from it. Having said I don't love the film, I adore the ending. It's open to endless interpretation because it offers no clear resolution, no explanation for what we have seen. It's a film of unreliable narrators, whose history has been muddied by more of them. Until Siegfried Kracauer made it the central tenet of his book, no one suggested that Caligari predicted Hitler. Even Janowitz admitted that the theme of a mentally subjugating tyrant was not something he and Mayer had intended, claiming that he only realised their subconscious intent years later. Janowitz never worked with Wiener again, but Mayer, whose thoughts on this we frustratingly don't have, did, twice. Which seems odd if he thought Wiener raped his work. While Mayer's film career went from strength to strength, Janowitz peaked with Caligari and within a few years quit the industry. This was his cinematic legacy, and Kracauer's theories made it seem all the more vital. By the time the book From Caligari to Hitler came out, Wiener had been dead for 10 years and unable to give his version of events. He was quietly written out of everything people loved about his film, and quietly blamed for everything that didn't fit Kracauer's theories. Incidentally, Kracauer's book also touches on Fritz Lang's Dr. Mabuse films, surely influenced by Caligari. Lang was originally set to direct Caligari, and is the only person to voluntarily claim that he came up with the framing story. Although he was involved only briefly and is another notoriously unreliable autobiographer. Robert Wiener's post-Caligari career continued with the same diversity and popularity, peppered with experimentation. Raskolnikov was a 4-hour adaptation of Dostoevsky made with members of the Moscow Art Theatre, possibly the first film to employ the Stanislavski method. The monumental Inri used the relationship between Christ and Judas to reflect current politics. Here we can actually see Robert Wiener at work behind the scenes. In 1924, Wiener was invited to Austria to help reinvigorate that country's film industry, producing films with his own production company, including The Hands of Orlak and 1925's Der Rosenkavalier, based on the opera by Richard Strauss, who conducted his own musical arrangement at the premiere, and stopped the film 20 times so his music could catch up. This was the peak of Wiener's career, but he would soon come up against the changing face of Germany. 1933's Typhoon was banned for offending the national sensitivities of the white race. The rise of Hitler affected the stars of Caligari very differently. Werner Krauss was a Nazi sympathiser who appeared in the infamous Jud Süß, the most virulently anti-Semitic of propaganda films. By contrast, Conrad Veidt, when filling out Joseph Goebbels' racial questionnaire, gave his religion as Jewish in solidarity with his wife, and left Germany shortly afterwards. Wiener too chose to leave, spending much of the next 5 years trying to remake Caligari, first in England, then in France. He collapsed on the set of his final film, Ultimatum, and died shortly afterwards. Throughout his career, Wiener had given his religion as Protestant, but after his death, the Reich Film Chamber listed him as non-Aryan, and his obituary in Der Film describes him as Jewish. A mystery to the end. When I started work on this, I swear I was trying to make it more about the film than the history, but it's Caligari. The subject of so much debate and analysis, the film has now passed beyond Wiener and Janowitz, Pommer and Meinert, Veit and Krauss, Mayer, Krakauer, and internet critics, and into the hands of the audience, who can make up their own minds. It was made to be watched, to entertain, to astound, and yes, it was made to mystify. In fact, there's only one way to understand it. You must become Caligari. Thanks for watching, and special thanks as always to all of our Patreon supporters whose generosity makes these longer specials possible. Writing this one has made me appreciate the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari more. Is it one that you love or merely admire? What other classics don't quite work for you? Let us know in the safe space below.